So the topic, I'll start off with something very personal. I suppose my main concern ever since I've been involved in Buddhism, which is actually approximately sort of 50 odd years now. I've been involved with Buddhism from the time I first went to India at the age of 17, ending up with the Tibetan community by default, just because it was too hot down on the plains in India and they sent me up to the hills. And it just happened to be where the Tibetans were hanging out, up in Dharamsala at that time. And I started studying there. And it's a familiar story. So anybody of our generation, you probably speak to, Stephen, Martine, anybody of that generation probably did something similar. It might not have been India, but it might have been somewhere else. In Martine's case, it was Korea. But one of the things that really was important to me, even when I first began to study, was ethics. Was the whole topic of ethics. And I was, what I would say, was fairly precocious when I was young. I mean, I used to carry Nietzsche around with me at the age of 10 or 11. I couldn't say I understood that much, but it might have been a bit of showing off as well. But I was carrying Nietzsche around and trying to read it, and eventually I really started to do it. And some of the things he was saying was really inspiring me to think ethically about our situation. And when I came to Buddhism, I brought the same sort of sense of inquiry to it as that. And so over the recent years, I've really come back to that topic. My doctoral thesis, by the way, was also on ethics. I mean, I did a doctoral thesis on Heidegger and Longchen Rabjampa, who's a 14th century Tibetan thinker, basically because they start off in a similar place, which is to talk about ethics was unethical, which is a very interesting statement. We're not going to go down that route tonight, because I don't want to bombard you with Heidegger or anything like that at this stage. But really, this is by way of an introduction, just to say why this topic, why I'm talking about this, why I continue to talk about it actually frequently now. Every opportunity I get, I really try to bring back, what are we doing when we sit down and do this funny thing called meditation? And I don't know if you realize how peculiar it is in many ways, is it? I mean, we sit in this funny posture, shutting our eyes often, although that's not necessarily traditional. When you look at those ancient statues of the Buddha, you'll see the eyes half open. But, we sit in this funny way and we do this peculiar thing for however long you might do it, either in a group or individually. What's it for? That's the big question, isn't it? Now, if you're coming from a traditional point of view, a traditional Buddhist point of view, you might say, well, it's to become awakened or enlightened. That was the old-fashioned phrase, to achieve nirvana. All of these grandiose statements. And I want to bring it down to life, really, which is one of the reasons I think we're doing this practice, and one of the reasons I think the Buddha taught this practice. And this is not necessarily something all teachers will agree with, but one of the reasons I think that the Buddha was teaching this was actually how to live a flourishing life with others. And the moment we start to talk about with others, not on your own, not as a hermit, not as an ascetic in seclusion somewhere. I found that one to my cost. There was no seclusion in Buddhist monasteries, for example. Tibetan Buddhist monastery is about the noisiest place I've ever been, living in there. If you're not in that seclusion and you're living with others, then we're automatically into the field of how am I dealing with others? How am I working with them, responding to them, reacting to them, all of the things that we know. I'm not going to take the Sartrean stance, which was Sartre's idea that hell was other people. His idea, in fact, he wrote a whole play about it, about three people trapped in a room. It goes under the English translations, no exit. And they're there for eternity. These three people stuck in a room with their stories, in a way, almost torturing each other. And that was hell was other people. Now, if we don't take that rather pessimistic view of being with others in that way, then we're talking about, well, how do we move in this world with others, being with others? How do we move in this world, not with just human others, but with non-human others? how do we move in this world where we respond to the environment, obviously crucial at this period of time. How do we respond to the environment in a way that isn't simply destructive? These are all ethical questions. I've entitled quite a number of the courses I've taught on ethics, How to Live, What to Do. It's not my phrase, it's actually a phrase that comes from a poet, somebody called Wallace Stevens, who was an American poet, many of you might know, who died about 1955. I think his dates were from the sort of late 1880s to 1955. And that was his fundamental question. And I think, in a way, it's my fundamental question. And so by way of intro, as I say, that's kind of setting the scene for why I'm talking about what we're doing. So I'm going to, if you like, lay my cards right on the table right at the start and say, well, this funny thing that we call meditation, this peculiar, either walking up and down in a Ministry of Silly Walks way, whatever it may be, walking up and down in that particular way, which is equally, I might say, as important as sitting meditation, sitting practice. And the sitting practice itself, well, why are we developing the awareness and the structures of awareness, or trying to increase those structures of awareness that we have and possess already? Why are we trying to do it? And you've heard my answer in a way. I've already said it. It's actually in order to be in this world in a different way, to be much, much more responsive in this world. So, you heard, from my resume of what I've done. One of the things I was involved with was, the master's degree in Oxford. In fact, I ended up as co-director of the master's degree in Oxford, where we were teaching mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to psychiatrists and doctors and physicians and all sorts of people in that way, including even physiotherapists and dentists, to try and calm their patients down before they went into the dentist surgery. And yet, somehow, even having been involved that, I still think it's missing the point slightly. I think it's being sold slightly short. Now, I say that as having been an insider in that whole movement. And I think it's a very important movement, and I wouldn't want to denigrate it. And I think the people who are involved in that movement of secularizing meditation practice in a way that's accessible to people who will never go in a million miles near a book on Buddhism or come to a Buddhist session or center or anything like that. So it's making something accessible to them that can actually change your life. And I think there's a sort of bit of sneakiness in here. I always used to say this to our students, there's a sort of sneakiness in this, that we tell you, sit down and do this practice and you might gain some calm. But actually what I'm saying at the back of it is this might severely change your life. If you, and that's a kind of hidden agenda. I don't know if you've noticed that. I always remember somebody coming up to me, a guy at a house once, who was on retreat, and saying, during one of our interviews, said, ever since I've been doing this practice, life has got more difficult. And I said, well, it's working then. And I meant that seriously. I mean, that's partly joking, but I meant it seriously as well, because if there is an opening of awareness, not a closing of awareness, then you're opening up to the complexity of life. You're opening up to the complexities that we're all engaged in everyday communication, in everyday attitudes, in everyday activities. When you're talking to your partner, to your friend, to a work colleague, to what you buy, as a consumer. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not quite sure, none of us can avoid being consumers in the society in some way. So we're always looking at, if we have awareness, hopefully at what we are doing, how I'm living. We might even be doing that with an aspiration to wanting to be different in some way, to change our lives. I said the hidden agenda is changing your life. I actually personally don't think that anybody ends up in a meditation session without actually that being somewhere part of what they're wanting to do. In the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy world, certainly that was the case when I started off at Oxford. It was primarily for depression. So you knew that the group who was sitting in front of you were there because they had a problem, you know, and that problem was depression. And so they knew why they were wanting to do it, or give it a try. Let's put it that way, or give it a try. Most of these people had been through the mill. They'd done many, many different things, you know, the medications and all of the usual routes, including sometimes long-term therapy, and still found that they were, you know, suffering in this particular way. And I deliberately use that word. And so, you know, well, by the time they got to, I don't know, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy class, they were saying, well, I'll give it a try. It was almost like that attitude. You know, I'll give it a try rather than I think this is going to work and it's going to really change my life. I think there was obviously that hope at the back of their minds. But I think all of us actually possibly have that hope at the back of our minds when we sit down and we engage in this, what I'm calling funny practice that we engage in. But I'm thinking also, and again, I keep wanting to remind you as we go through, there's something more to it than that. What does that change mean? You know, what does that change mean to all of us that we engage in? Yeah. How would we see it manifesting in our lives? All too often, meditation, let me give you the kind of caricature of it. Often meditation seems to be an individual thing that we engage in, and it's usually just for our own well-being. That's certainly the way it's being sold, often in the secular world. And whilst I don't disagree with some of that, I'm not going to sort of take violent offence and say, well, that's not really what it's about at all. I think it is about that. But it's also about our ways of being with others, how we're living, engaging in a questioning about the ways that we live. So actually, I think often a lot of what goes on in meditation is that developing of an awareness that we can take out and using a questioning attitude towards our lives. Yeah? Rather than just giving us answers. Personally, I don't think answers are very useful. Yeah? Often that's what we look for. We look for somebody to give us the answers. Yeah, okay, that's it. I've got the answer now. Everything's fine. Actually, it's not. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. When often we're given the answers, it might fit certain circumstances, and other circumstances it doesn't fit at all. And so what we get, I think, arising partly out of this is, firstly, being curious about life. Yeah. How curious are you about life? I mean, it's a general question. Doesn't it, for those who are coming tomorrow, I'll be talking about this more tomorrow, aren't you sometimes astounded by what goes on in life? Doesn't it sometimes strike you as ludicrous? Sometimes actually there's a huge amount of pathos in life, in what we're engaging in as human beings. And actually, we often externalize that, but this is one opportunity we get to look actually at our, if you like, experience. Yeah, and I don't want to keep using that as a word because it's actually not just an experience as something, as a thing, it's something that's constantly unfolding in our lives. And aren't you curious about that? Yeah. Again, I think human beings are very peculiar. We like to talk about ourselves, and yet this attitude of bringing interest going on, have you noticed, I always remember Ajahn Sucitto introducing one meditation and saying, let's sit down and meditate for want of something better to do. Yeah. And I think it's quite a nice attitude to bring that humour to what we're doing here. But also to bring that sense of, isn't it interesting what's actually happening with, let's take this thing that we're always taught to focus on, meditating on the breath. How many times, for those of you who've been going to meditation sessions for long periods of time, and doesn't sometimes it seem somewhat, boring? Here we go with the breath yet again. Yeah, how many breaths do you need to look at before you get the general idea? Now, I'm joking about this and sort of sending it up slightly, but there's a serious point behind it, because I don't know if you notice what's happening in that attitude. We're homogenizing experience. You know, we're taking the experience of this particular breath and perhaps followed by another breath and saying, oh, now I understand the breath. Yeah. Without actually beginning to perceive what is unique within that particular moment. As I often say to, particularly when I'm teaching retreats, trying to make people aware that this breath, let's be curious about it because it's your life. Worry when it stops. It is your life. So in a sense, it's not just us breathing, it's life breathing us. Yeah? And it's a way of reframing that whole sense of what am I looking at? I'm looking at the life process in this. Now, surely that's got to be of some interest in this whole issue of what it means to be in this world. Surely that's got to be of some interest. And so when we start to have these injunctions that you find in certainly early Buddhist meditational texts of sitting down and developing something which is in Pali called atapi, and it's usually translated into English as ardent or ardency. Yeah, some of you might have seen this, for example, if you've looked at the Satipatthana Sutta. This is the locus classicus of all early Buddhist meditational texts. It's the one, in a sense, which is the foundation even for the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy courses, as, in a sense, interpreted by particularly a lot of those teachers in the States, and John Kabat-Zinn in particular. He had Zen influences as well. But this was the locus classicus. This is where you find, if you like, the most specific instructions on Buddhist meditational practice. And this one attitude, this word atapi, well, the word, let me give you a little bit of etymology. The word atapi is derived from tapas in Sanskrit, which isn't something you get in a bar in Barcelona, by the way. Tapas is fire, and it's a purificatory fire. In early Vedic material, is the fire that purifies. So all of that yogic stuff that some of you might have been involved in, I mean, I certainly was when I was much younger, was actually to develop a certain degree of tapas, which was actually to burn up the impurities within you. So you engaged in physical and meditational practices in order to engage in that. That word, that fieriness, carries over into this sense of ardency. So when the Buddha is saying to us, sit down under a tree, cross your legs, and do this practice, and he said, develop your mindfulness in front of you. I won't necessarily go into that, but he says, develop your mindfulness in front of you with ardency. He's not kind of giving you sort of lukewarm instructions. It's interesting, there's a connection in both Pali and Latin, both derived from the same linguistic group. The word that ardency comes from, it has a Latin root, which is ardere. And the Latin root means to burn. So actually what it's saying is, when you sit down and engage in this practice, it's not just a sort of vague curiosity, it's a burning, passionate interest to engage with what you're doing. How many of us can say that? Every time, every time you go to King Alfred School, for example, and whoever's giving you your instructions there, and you sit and being told to sit and practice, whatever the practice may be, and it's usually the breath, I'm assuming. How many of us bring that burning interest to what we're doing? There's a sort of checklist we run through as well, isn't there? You've probably noticed some people will say, be aware of your backsides on your chair, or your legs on the floor, or your feet on the floor, your clothing touching your body, all of these usual things that we go through. And you can do them sort of like a checklist. Yeah. Have you done this? Yeah. You go through, yeah, I've done that bit. Yeah, I've done that bit. Yeah. How interested were you? How really interested were you in that case? Now, obviously, this is not touching on ethics yet, but we're developing an attitudinal aspect of the way that we approach what is going on in our lives. Yeah? And so, one of the other words that's used in the text, for example, is the word sikati, which means to train in Pali. So we're training ourselves. Now, is the training just to sit on a cushion or under the foot of a tree, as it says in the Pali text? Is that what the training is about? No, I see some of you shaking your head, and I would totally agree. I don't think that's what it's about. It's not to become better at sitting. As Ajahn Chah once said, even chickens can do that. So it's not about training ourselves as being better in sitting. It's about training ourselves in a degree of awareness that we bring to whatever aspect of life is confronting us at this moment. Whether it be here or whether it be when you go home, what aspect of life is confronting you at that moment of time? And can I bring those skills that I develop on the cushion to that life and actually use it in the service of being able to question what I'm engaging in life? The moment we start to talk about ethics, I always remember we ran a course at Oxford, and it was going to be on the ethics of mindfulness. If we'd done something on, how do you develop mindfulness in this way, or what do you do to do, better on your kind of score sheets and the training practice and everything else, we usually got full sessions for this, and this was open to the general community of people who were teaching mindfulness. But when we put on ethics of mindfulness, we had 2 people sign up. Yeah, and normally we'd have between 30 and 40 for this. So it's interesting, isn't it? It's very, very interesting the way even the word ethics can be such a turn-off for people. I've got my own ideas about why I think that is, and I'll share those with you and see if they kind of correspond to anything. And please remember, you're going to have a chance to discuss this, for us to discuss this. I think it's partly because we associate ethics with rules. This is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do. And it has that sort of finger wagging quality to it, doesn't it? You're being good or you're being bad, and it sort of wags its finger at you. And actually ethics isn't about that at all. Again, it's interesting, if you just look at the derivation of the word ethics, it comes down as it does in the West through the Greek. And the Greek actually has 2 meanings to it. Etike, which is actually one aspect of this, or ethos, another word you might know, but etike is the one that's used normally. It means the development of character. You develop your character through what you do. That was very much Aristotle's idea. You're developing your character through what you do. So if you actually do unskillful and unpleasant things a lot of the time, that will develop your character in a particular way. If you do things which are much more skillful, and I'm deliberately using that word here, which are much more skillful rather than good or bad, let's drop that. That gets into moralizing straight away. A lot of what we do is simply unskillful in life. However, we can develop a skillfulness in regards to the way that we engage in life. And that skillfulness itself will develop your character. Now, most of us, of course, are hybrids of that. We we clearly, in some areas of our lives, are quite skillful, and in other areas of our life, we're either blind or unskillful. And actually, the blindness often leads to an unskillfulness as well. You know? We're not aware, in other words. We don't shine the light of awareness into certain aspects of life, and we go by habit much of the time. And so, when we are engaging in this practice, although it doesn't have ethics as its primary, saying develop this and you're developing an ethical thing, the skill that we're learning is a skill that you bring to how to live, what to do. And when we're starting to talk about how to live and what to do, we're talking about ethics. Are you interested? I'm kind of throwing it open here. Are you interested? Because actually, that's what it is. So when we're talking about ethics, we're not talking about rules. Yeah? We're not talking about, a simple list, a checklist. Most of us will have come probably from some theistic religious tradition. Even if we haven't accepted it and practiced within it, we will know it in some way. It's there in the background. In some sense, it's unusual if we haven't been exposed to it in some area of our lives. And I think that's what we're objecting to a lot of the time. In a more secularized world that we live in, I think we're strangely ambiguous. On one hand, we don't like that authority, and on the other hand, we seek it out. We want somebody to tell us what to do. But we certainly don't want that old, traditional, religious stuff, even sort of humanistic stuff, to tell us what to do. And yet we seek for our authorities in other places. We're very ambiguous, I think, in that sense. So, if we're not talking about rules, and we're not talking about that simple set of do's and don'ts. Now, Buddhism isn't immune to that, as you will probably know. Buddhism does have what in terms rules of training. It has rules of training. So, listen to that language, rules of training. So we train ourselves in this awareness and the development of this awareness in what we might call mindfulness practice, or certainly sati practice, satipatthana type practice. We train ourselves in that awareness, and yet there are guidelines and other rules which say that actually in the absence of having, if you like, a correct training attitude, we might take on these as being useful heuristic devices. They help us to find ways of living. So I think that's possibly the way to look at any, injunctions that you find within Buddhism. Certainly in relationship to what is generally known as, for example, the 5 precepts that are there, the 5 lay precepts. Lay people get off incredibly lightly in terms of the rules. If you're a Theravadan bhikkhu, you have 227 of them. But actually, the really important ones boil down to these 5 rules. Rules of training. It's training you in a certain degree of awareness. So it's training rules around, for example, harm, around speech, around taking what is not offered, around, interestingly, this appalling translation that we usually get for the 3rd precept, which is usual, sexual misconduct. The actual way of translating it properly is sensual misconduct. Far wider, isn't it, if you think about that? It may have, under that umbrella, aspects of sexuality and the way that we can unskillfully engage in sexual activity. But the primary thing is sensual. How are we using our senses? Are our eyes, our ears seeking out? We're almost like sensory guided missiles. We're looking out for that which is sensorily stimulating a lot of the time. We can't help that. We're embodied, you know. But is there a wise and skillful way of using the senses and an unskillful way? And this is saying, be aware that there's an unskillful way of using these senses. So it's not that necessarily turning away, although you will find aspects of that within the Buddhist tradition. I don't want to downplay that at all. You will find aspects of this within the Buddhist tradition. Aspects of, in a sense, turning against the body. You don't always find that, I think, in the earliest strata of text. This is what I call monastic mind. You know, this is men left on their own. You know, dreaming up why they're going to be sexually attracted or whatever. You know, it's about their problems really as much as anything else. And I think if you actually look through, not just Buddhism, but if you look through the history of religions and particularly monastic orders, you'll find similar things occurring in most of them. You know, you demonize what you are attracted to. Yeah. You know, that's what happens in that. And if you're not doing that, it's actually saying, look how you're using your senses. You know, are you using them wisely? Are you using them skillfully? Or are you just indulging? Have you got hungry eyes? Have you got hungry ears? You know, just wanting more and more and more. And as you know, when we're stimulated, often that stimulation is addictive. You want more and more of it. And it has a sort of increasing velocity of, that you're wanting not just more of the same, you want more and a little bit stronger of that. Yeah. So you have that within Buddhism, but hear that word, training. This is training, making you aware of the aspects of life that you need to bring awareness into. Yeah? And these are 5 pretty basic aspects of life. I mean, the last one I always find very interesting. I might as well mention this because it's there. I mean, the actual Pali, when you read the Pali, actually doesn't say anything about drugs. It says something about what in ancient Indian language was strong liquor. Fermented liquors, basically, is the Pali for it. And it's saying, don't do it. And why don't do it? Not because the Buddha was a prude, because it's saying if you're trying to develop awareness, this is doing the complete opposite. Yeah? And actually, sometimes I have a whiteboard up here and I usually list them and I say, well, with this last one, you're more likely to commit all of the above. Engage in harm, engage in sensual misconduct, engage in stealing, all of those things are much easier to do, aren't they, under the influence of something. So it's really more about the sense of what are you doing in your life? What are you imbibing is actually pulling against what you're trying to develop, which is this sense of awareness. Now, if we're talking about virtue, and I think we can in this, there's an interesting word in Greek for this, which is arete. Arete means excellence. Developing a sense of excellence in what you're doing and ways of behaving and that. And in a sense, that was certainly what early Greek ethics aimed at. Literally, they had a word which was called hamartia, which was meant you aimed at something and you either hit the mark or you missed it. A bit like a dart. You threw a dart and you either hit the center, the bullseye, or you didn't. You somehow missed the mark is literally the translation of ahamartia, which means you didn't get there at that. But you try again in each case. So if we're talking about virtue, and we're talking about training, and we're talking about awareness, and we're talking about ethics, these are not separate ideas. They're all coming together. Yeah. And so from this very simple practice, well, which isn't so simple when we get down to it, often is it? Yeah. I always used to think, when I had a group, even when I teach retreats still, which I haven't done for a few years now, but when I've been teaching retreats, even online, I think, just how brave people are. In sitting and engaging in this process. Yeah. One of the qualities they're developing in that process is the quality of virya. Virya Again, an interesting word in Pali and Sanskrit. Some of you who might do yoga know there's a pose which is called Virya-asana, which is the warrior pose. Yeah? Virya is a quality of courage, but it's also the quality of energy. Yeah? And so if you'll find, for example, in Mahayana Buddhism, the idea of the perfection of virya, the perfection of energy. Yeah, but it's also the perfection of courage. That's there. And so actually, just by engaging in the process, you're developing something. Just by engaging in that process. And it takes a degree of courage to do that, because it's not always pleasant what you discover, is it? Yeah, not everything's nice. You often are engaged in, examining or having arise aspects of the psyche, of your own psyche, that you've probably kept a lid on. That's for some reason. Yeah? And you're getting a chance to examine it. Not necessarily to trace it back to its origins or anything like that, but just to see it and acknowledge it within that. And so you have, I always used to think, when we have these meditations, which, I don't even like the word meditation actually, when we have these processes of cultivation, where we're cultivating, for example, what's called the Brahma Viharas. The Brahma Viharas, and you have the cultivation of compassion or kindness within these cultivations. And often they're done very systematically, where you take different, what I call the cast of characters, and you go through the cast of characters. You've probably done this, some of you. You start off with, somebody who's a friend, for example. Eventually you get to somebody who's the difficult person. You've gone through a neutral person, somebody you sort of hardly even acknowledge or don't necessarily see much. There might be somebody you see every day, but you don't really see them at all. And you get to this last person who's the cast, in the cast of characters, and this last person is the difficult person. Well, actually, the surprising thing is you're the difficult person. It's not somebody externalized. It's very easy to externalize that. But in many cases, what you're dealing with is the difficulty, which is you in this. And what you're coming across often in that difficulty is the things that stop you from actualizing what your possibilities are in life. Who you would like to be in this life. How I would like to manifest in my day-to-day life, in my interactions, in my just living in the world in the ordinary way, not in some sort of superhuman way, but just living in the world in an ordinary way, in a transformed manner. Again, we're into the field of ethics in that. And so this awareness that we're developing in the practice, this awareness is in the service of that development of character. That development, perhaps, of our possibilities, of being different, of being less reactive in this world. Reactivity is one of the biggest problems that we have. So much so that anybody who knows you well can play off it. I don't know if you've noticed that. We talk about having our buttons pushed. That generally means somebody knows you and they can get you, get you going in these ways. Perhaps it's the desideratum of many of us that not have our buttons pushed in that sense. Not to be reactive to everything perhaps you hear in the media or read in the newspapers or however you collect your information. Not to be reactive to that difficult person you might find in the office, that difficult person you might find in whatever situation it is in your family. I mean, that's often where they manifest, isn't it? The difficult people. And you might like to be more or less reactive in those situations. If we're asking ourselves that question, I would say we're back in the realm of ethics. We're back in the realm of ethics. What do I do when I'm confronted by this difficult person? Do I walk away? Do I sit and open myself to listen just a little bit to them? Perhaps slightly longer than I would do normally? Yeah. There are many, many possibilities in those situations, and I think that's what we're training ourselves into. Not that there's going to be a simple solution to how I deal with the difficult person, but in a sense, asking ourselves the question, what is the right or the most skillful thing to do at this moment? Yeah? Have you asked yourself that question when we move into those kind of difficult situations? The interesting thing is, of course, that actually, I mean, this is something I'll be talking about tomorrow, but one of the things that Merleau-Ponty, the French philosopher, says is that every situation we find ourselves in is an ethical situation. Every situation, because we're having to decide. And we don't have rules for that other than the moralities of our societies. Yeah? And the moralities of our societies are interesting. Again, what is morality? And often the two words are used interchangeably, aren't they? Morality and ethics. And actually in Buddhism they're kept very separate. They're two separate realms. And morality is the sort of consensus. If you think about the Latin root again, mores, that is where it comes from, morality. So the mores of our society are the consensual agreement that, if we were a society, that we agreed upon as being the rules that we live by. So we don't upset each other as much as possible, but it doesn't necessarily make them skillful. It doesn't necessarily, I'm going to use this word in scare quotes, so hear it that way, it doesn't necessarily make it right. In fact, your society might be, a very corrupt society, a very prejudicial society. You've only got to take something like Germany in 1933. As a society, it's telling you what you should be doing to a certain group of people, and you have many, many people going, yes, we will do that. This is the right and the good thing to do. Doesn't make it ethical though, does it? So mores is not ethics. Mores is simply, in a sense, the agreement that I have with others, but it's open to question. It's open to question. Ethics is something else. Ethics is coming from our own responsiveness to the world. Again, let's bracket out the idea you're always going to be right. That's what I would call arrogance. If I think I'm always right, that's like the perpetual adolescent who always thinks they're right about everything. So sometimes it's useful, for example, to question the mores of our society. Very useful. In fact, don't, just go along with it. Put the, if you like, the moralities of our society, even if it's a liberal, democratic society, put them under question. Don't necessarily accept everything that's being said to you as being, the right ways to live in our societies. In fact, a lot of the things that are being propagated, for example, in the world at the moment as the right ways to live are clearly destructive. Clearly very destructive. So from an ethical point of view, they're wanting. I'm not being a bad person, I'm just following what society is telling me is okay to do. So in a way, if we do that, we're living with thoughtlessness, a degree of thoughtlessness. And what I think the meditational process is actually waking us up. Remember, that was the goal. The goal wasn't enlightenment. That's a strange word. I always think enlightenment only occurred in the 18th century in the West. That was the only time it occurred. There was a whole period called the Enlightenment. What the Buddhist approach was waking up. Now, one of the classic ways of putting this was waking up to the way things were. And that was formulated in waking up to impermanence, waking up to dukkha. I hope everybody's familiar with that word. Yeah, everybody? Yep, okay. Waking up to dukkha and waking up to anatta. Anatta, which means actually the lack of essentiality, actually. Self, it's often referred to. Lack of self. A lack of anything fixed with an individual. Yeah. I always say to groups, for example, when you hear that sense of anatta, hear it as good news. If you're not fixed, you can change. Yeah? And you are changing. You always have been. How do you want that change to go? That's an ethical question. What direction do you want the change that you are to move in? Yeah? Because we can be very complacent, we can, if you like, it can just be unfolding. Just through our past histories, through our complacency to how we respond to life, and it can go in a certain direction. Yeah? But it hasn't, in a sense, been directed through your own sense of freedom in that instance. It's been simply what is playing out from your past and your present into your future. Here. And so it's important, if we are, if you like, to take on board, which seems so important in the Western world, and we've talked about it constantly, in Western philosophy and things like that, that sense of autonomy and freedom that we're supposed to have, then actually it's taking on board that freedom, grasping what it entails to be free individuals and to direct our lives in a particular way. And it's interesting, of course, that the Buddha says my teaching has one flavor, and the flavor is freedom. Yeah? Now that's not the freedom to do anything. It's the freedom to know what to do and how to do it. Yeah? And again, I hope within what I'm saying, because I just don't want this to be a monologue, I hope you're sort of hearing questions within this. It's not just I should do, it's how do I do? How do I engage with this? How do I respond appropriately? How do I, if you like, open up and see the ethical situations in which I'm engaged, and be aware that almost every gesture, every inflection of our voices has a consequence. Yeah? Now, I know that may sound like a terribly onerous burden to place on you. I think, I'm crushed under the weight of the thought of everything. But we speak very much, don't we, in the Western world, certainly, and I think this has become, not just the Western world, this has become the way we speak about things. We talk about body language. Our bodily, gestural sense of being has an effect. Yeah? Our linguistic dimension of life, our speech, has an effect. Yeah? I can say something in, fairly moderate, but the tone will change it completely. Yeah? It might be to you, as you say that, pretty innocuous, but actually might have devastating consequences on another in the way that you say it. Yeah? As I say, I don't want to lay a burden on you, but I'm just trying to make you aware of, in a sense, the enormity of the project that we're engaged in here. So, if you want to engage with all these dimensions of our life, in other words, our bodily, our mental, and obviously our speech functions in life, our speaking being, then we need to develop some awareness of this. Yeah? We need to open up a field of awareness, a spaciousness, in order to, I'm going to use obviously the ocular metaphor here, in order to see. If I don't do that, then I'm not really seeing. Yeah? I mean, again, I don't want to give you too many Pali etymologies, but often this practice, many of you will know, it's called Vipassana. Yeah? which actually one of the etymologies of that is to see clearly. Yeah, the word pasana in the Vipassana comes from pasati, which means to see in Pali, yeah? Or pashati in Sanskrit. And so what we're doing is developing, and hear that as a metaphor, in all of our sensory embodied ways of perceiving which are far more skillful, far more open, far more receptive to what is going on in the world than simply applying a rule. I think actually, you might not like it, but applying a rule is really easy. You know, if somebody tells you don't do that, you might go, oh, I really want to do it, but you don't do it because somebody's told you not to. But that's fairly easy to follow. To develop this acquired kind of awareness that I think the Buddha is speaking about in these early approaches is much, much more difficult. It means often moving into what I call enormously grey areas of life. Yeah. We all like clarity, don't we? One of the things I think we search for, we strive for, is certainty. What the Buddha gives you is uncertainty. Yeah? Are you comfortable with that? Are you comfortable with being uncertain about what you've done or said? Yeah? It's difficult, isn't it? You know, just thinking about it, I'm sort of posing it to you as a question, but you know, it's difficult if we think about it because we want to know we've done the right thing. Yeah? We want to know that. How will you know that? You would have to have a God's eye view. You know, what's in philosophy we use this term subspecie eternitatis, the view from eternity. Yeah. We don't have that view. You know, if there was a God, it would only be a God that had that view. So we can't absolutely know. So we're always in the territory of uncertainty. We're always in the territory of trying to do our best. Yeah? That is uncomfortable, isn't it? I don't hope you're uncomfortable, but I hope you get a sense of the discomfort that comes with that lack of certainty. Yeah. There's a lovely story in Greek ethics, which is a story of even doing nothing is actually produces consequences. And the story in Greek ethics is a story of basically a donkey that's tied up between two buckets. One bucket has got something attractive in, like carrots, and the other one's got oats in it, and the donkey sits in the middle going, which one do I want? You know, shall I have the carrots? They look very attractive. Shall I have the oats? They also look really attractive. Carrots, oats, carrots, oats, carrots, oats, and eventually the donkey starves to death because it can't make a decision. Yeah. Have you ever felt that ethical questions are sometimes like that? That the only thing to do is to do something, even though you can't absolutely know that it's the right thing. Yeah? Because there's no guarantee or guarantor of the rightness of that action. Yeah? The only way that you'll know, if you like, any degree of rightness or wrongness in the action is by the consequences, and we don't even necessarily perceive those directly. Yeah, so we're always left in a degree of uncertainty. So I'm trying to sell you this thing called awareness. Yeah? How am I doing so far? Have I ever sold it any yet? Yeah. So awareness is absolutely vital, absolutely essential. And awareness in the sense of what we're developing in this meditative process, and I'm going to question that, even that word. Yeah. The awareness that we're developing in that meditative process doesn't find its culmination sitting on a cushion. It cannot do. Yeah. What it's doing is, let's go back to my little starting point where I said, we asked to look at aspects of our bodily sitting here. If we're sitting here now, I'm going through a meditation here, just sitting, how's your body at this moment? How does it feel? Does it feel tight? Does it feel loose? Can you feel the weight of the body sitting here? Yeah. That don't have any major ethical implications, does it? But what it's doing is making you attend to what's actually happening at this moment. And if we, in a way, it's like reading your situation now. Yeah? How am I reading this situation that I'm in now? And it's not, I'm not in a terribly complicated ethical situation. I'm just sitting here doing this. I just be sitting here with my eyes closed, waiting for the bell to ring. So it's not terribly complicated, but I'm being asked to develop a quality of not just attention, but of focus. That allows me to engage with what is and actually start to perceive the subtleties of it. Start to perceive the intricacies of even a simple activity like breathing. Because actually, when you start to focus on the breath as, for example, a unique phenomena at this moment, that the breath you're taking at this moment is never going to come back, it's unique to this moment. It's a whole different way of approaching something extremely familiar, isn't it? We all know what breathing is. We do it all the time. I always thank myself that I don't have to think about breathing. It happens, part of the autonomic nervous system. Although I can control my breath, I don't normally. My breath just comes and goes, and that's what we're being asked to attend to. Just that coming and going of the ordinary, average, everyday type breathing activities we're engaging in. So this is not yogic breathing. This is not pranayama, for those who are familiar with yoga. This is a very, very specific to its ordinariness, the ordinariness of the breath. What happens when you start to focus on ordinariness? I think in that ordinariness of our ordinary averageness of life, we discover something extraordinary. And those situations, rather than just being difficult, complicated, how do I sort this out? If we can bring an attitude that sees this as an extraordinary opportunity to respond in this situation, whatever that might be, in this situation, in this particular unique situation. So we're not just applying a rule, but having to try to respond in that situation, then isn't that extraordinary as well? So even that being called upon, and that's often how we're being called upon to respond to this. My response might be to turn away and walk away. My response might be to engage, to just be here, to be silent, to say something. You can think of all the range of possibilities that you can perhaps engage in that situation. And yet, you still can't be absolutely certain that what you're doing. It's something that we're only learning by, in a sense, measuring and going through that uncertainty. We can say perhaps what we might not want to do in those situations, but can we really truly grasp after and say, this is what I really should do? Now, if we're doing that, I think we're not really there. If we're saying, what should I do? We're looking for something outside of ourselves. What this is doing is putting you bodily into that situation where the responsiveness is coming from both, without sounding romantic about it, both from heart and mind in that situation. Now, it might not turn out to be absolutely the right response, but at least we can say it was done with that heartfulness or that mindfulness. Because the alternative is forgetfulness. And that's one of the big things that's spoken about. So we have what's called, a caring attitude, which is appamada. or we have a non-caring attitude or forgetfulness, which is pamada in this instance. Yeah? The forgetfulness is not just I forget what to do, it's actually I'm not interested in knowing what to do in this. I'm not engaged. I might even try to be moral by just applying a rule that says I ought to do this at this situation or any given situation that's remotely similar. Yeah? But is that coming from a heartfelt response? I would say possibly not. Yeah? Yeah. So, even with these two major terms that we have for what we're developing, I think we have two aspects which are actually ethical in this development of awareness, in development of what we're trying to, and here's my preferred word to meditation, cultivate in our lives. What we're trying to cultivate. The word in Pali, just to give you why I'm using this, the word in Pali is bhavana. Some of you may know that. It's derived from a root in Pali and Sanskrit, which is bu, which means actually to bring into being, to grow, to manifest. It has all of these connotations. I think it's very agrarian. It's very horticultural. What do you want to grow in your life? Yeah, what do you want to grow? Yeah, it's really easy to grow weeds. You just don't do anything, isn't it? Just let it go to wild. Let it go wild. But it's very difficult to grow and know what you want to grow in your life. So we're cultivating. And I think, just as an aside, really, the Buddha often was speaking to people within a society which was primarily an agrarian society. People knew about growing things. So he's using that language. If you're putting back into a socio-historical context, that was the society he was speaking to. So people knew about that. And so talking about not meditating, I think meditating is a wonderful deferral, actually, in the West. I have sadly to admit in the past sometimes when I said I'd go away and meditate on it, means I'm going to do absolutely nothing about it. Whereas this is saying to you, cultivate, grow. So we might have satibhavana, the cultivation of mindfulness or mindful awareness. Metabhavana, the cultivation of kindness, friendliness here. And I always make a plea at this stage, don't ever think of the word metta as loving kindness. Please, please drop that. It's a horrible translation. The word metta comes from a friend, from Maitri in Sanskrit. And so what you're doing is making a friend of yourself and of others. It's an extension of friendship, generosity in a way as well towards others. How would elsewhere? Goodwill, that would be another way of translating it. A sense of goodwill towards others and yourself. So these are the things you're trying to cultivate, to grow in your awareness. Now you don't grow them just for yourself. You grow them in order to be with others. You grow them so that I can perhaps, not with certainty respond in the right way, but at least respond rather than react in those situations. So ethics here is down to, in a sense, a degree of uncertainty about what I can do. And there's many other ways of approaching ethics, but I'm just talking about the awareness factor tonight. But that awareness factor won't give you certainty, but what it will give you is the ability to respond more wholeheartedly to what is going on.